Okay, welcome to the first episode of Steal My Sermon. Today we're going to be talking about the readings for Sunday, September 26th, which is Proper 21 Year B. We're going to talk through each of the readings and hopefully spark some ideas for sermons for all the clergy out there. So today I have a very special guest, the Reverend Brian Tarver. Brian is the rector of St. David's Episcopal Church in San Antonio and one of my good friends. Well, we'll go ahead and dive right into our show. I'm Alex Holloway.
I'm Brian Tarver.
And you are welcome to
Steal My Sermon.
Okay, so let's start with the Gospel. Mark 9:38 through 50. Brian, what kind of stood out to you in your studies or your thoughts about this?
The first thing that stood out is that I don't want to preach on this sermon or on this passage.
Why not?
Well, it's a difficult one to kind of weed through. There's a lot of hyperbole in Jesus's words about plucking your eye out, or if there's a great millstone hung around your neck. And so I think if I were to preach on this text, there would have to be a lot of kind of digging through the hyperbole to get to the point.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that I kind of discovered is that I didn't really realize before looking at this passage again this time that it's one of the Markan sandwiches. Where kind of there's an intercalation of two passages, and it's pretty subtle in this one. So Jesus is kind of confronting his disciples about who's the greatest, and then he picks up a child and is holding this child. And then there's all of this about, kind of someone casting out demons in the name of Jesus. And then we come back to the child.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of interesting to hear this again. I'm thinking about maybe Jesus like holding a child the entire time he's talking to the disciples.
That's kind of cool.
About who's the greatest, and then also someone kind of casting out demons in his name. I thought that was interesting.
That really changes it if you think about him holding a child the whole time. That's
right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah, I definitely, obviously, picked up on the hyperbole too. I think I kind of like it when Jesus goes like big like that. I mean, it does make preaching difficult because it's like, okay, Jesus doesn't want us to cut off our hands and things like that. But
Right.
I feel like it really hammers home the seriousness of the gospel. That Jesus isn't kidding around, and I kind of like that tone in this particular reading. But it is a little bit graphic. One thing that stood out to me was it feels timely, the message of whoever is not against us is for us. I feel like right now we're in such a divided time, as we all know, in our country, that it's feels very much us versus them, and there are all these litmus tests for are you on my team or the other team? Do you mask, do you not mask? That whole
Right.
thing. And I felt like Jesus saying, whoever is not against us is for us, kind of blows that up. It's just forget it. Don't get so caught up in who's on your team versus who's on something else. Just focus on how we're all working together for the gospel.
Right. That part made me think about when I was the soccer coach, coaching these little ones, and the most important thing that you have to teach them in the very beginning is which goal they're going to,
Mm-hmm.
and it always switches at halftime. So you start going towards the other goal, and it's always
It messes them up.
a source of chaos. And it would be funny because we would be, as the coaches, we would be yelling at our players to not stop the opponent from scoring in their own goal.
Right.
So just that's the image that came to mind with Jesus is,
Yeah.
don't stop them who does a deed of power in my name will be able to soon afterward, not speak evil of me. So it's just kind of the
I love
image
that.
that came to mind.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. Another place I kind of zeroed in on was this person who was out there driving out demons in Jesus' name. That he's unnamed, we have no idea who he is. Obviously, he has learned about Jesus and followed him in some way. But I found that striking because, like the disciples, I often feel like I want credit for everything I do.
Mhm.
And I think I strive to be like the people who are out there, just like doing ministry, doing God's will, without like seeking credit or media attention or, trademarking their idea or whatever. They're just like following God's will and not worrying about it. And I found it empowering that Jesus, said go for it. Like he wasn't trying to micromanage all the people who followed him and make sure they followed like his specific way of doing things. He was kind of like, he's casting out demons, that's great, run with it. And I don't know, I find that kind of freeing for us as disciples today.
Right.
And that's where, for those of you who are doing track 2, we're going to talk about track 1 today, but the numbers lesson from track 2 has the same theme, where some other people are prophesying outside the camp and someone comes and tattles on them to Moses. And he's like, are you jealous for my sake? Like, who cares? I wish that every person were prophesying the Lord. So
Right.
I love that kind of like non-competitive, like someone else's ministry or gift just doesn't cancel ours out. It just adds to the kingdom.
Right. Would you bring those two together, like the Numbers passage and with the gospel?
I would,
passage?
yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. If you're doing track 2. Yeah, that's kind of something that I was thinking about with this show, since this is our first episode, Steal My Sermon, is, it's in the name, Steal My Sermon. Like, I know every clergy person out there is scrambling every week to write their sermons and to find time to write their sermons. And I know we often are kind of like seminary colleagues will definitely lean on each other and ask, like, what are you preaching this week? And I think that kind of collaboration is really fruitful. And so that's part of kind of the vision of this show is like, take any idea or image you hear from this and run with it and make it your own.
Yeah, and I don't know about other clergy, but I feel like I have to come up with like some new perspective all the time, which puts a lot more pressure on it than, kind of repeating kind of old messages. I feel the pressure to do something new. So I think it's helpful to be given permission to kind of collaborate.
And I think there's a rich history of that too in the church. I mean, they used to have books of sermons that the priests would just read. And like, I think it's better to be, a little more engaged and creative than that. But there's, nothing new under the sun. We're all sharing the same gospel. Same lines, thinking about the hyperbolic, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, that kind of thing. I read something interesting. This is from the Zondervan Exegetical Commentary. I'd never heard this, that the hand signifies what is done, what one does. The foot signifies where one goes, and the eyes what one sees. That could be like an easy 3-point sermon, which again is not super common in the Episcopal Church, but you could, go that route and think about, all right, what do we do that leads us towards sin? Where do we go that leads us towards sin? What do we see? And talk about it from there.
Yeah. I think anything that I would talk about with those would have to tie back into Jesus holding the child, right? So how might those relate to the treatment of the vulnerable among us?
Exactly.
I think
Yeah.
it's not just about personal sin, but also about, Jesus holding this child in his life. So how do those relate to treatment of the vulnerable?
Yeah, I love that. So the gospel ends with this kind of enigmatic teaching about salt. Have salt among yourselves. That one also really stood out to me. And it reminded me of, do you remember Bishop Jeff Fisher's sermon about salt?
No.
He posted it on his blog, but it's about, he was preaching it to the Episcopal Church women at their annual retreat, so that was the context. But he started with the nursery rhyme, what are little girls made of, sugar and spice and everything nice. And he was like, his whole sermon was like, you're not called to be sugar and spice and everything nice, you're called to be salty.
Mm.
And he went back to all these salty women, and I really loved that. So I think that, doesn't necessarily have to be just about women, but we do have a salty woman in our Old Testament reading from Esther.
Mm-hmm.
You could talk about like how bold and daring she was. And you could talk about Mary Magdalene, Teresa of Avila. Again, these are women. You could talk about any salty person. But it just occurred to me, like, salt is powerful and transformative, and like you notice that you're not gonna, if you get a bite of salt, like it's gonna get your attention, and that's very different than kind of like a nice, quiet, like image of a Christian that we might sometimes have,
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
I feel like most people go down the route of, like salt can't lose its saltiness, like kind of the chemistry of that. I think that kind of goes away from the point Jesus is trying to make here. I mean, I think really them being the salt is tied into the greater purpose of Israel and being God's chosen ones. And so I would steer away from, can salt lose its saltiness, and more talk about, what their call is as disciples and in relation to this greater call on the Israelite people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. All right, you want to work backwards and talk about James?
Sure, let's move to James.
So this is my turn to be like, I don't want to preach on this passage. So I'll preach on the gospel, you preach on James. Because I love the book of James, but I really struggle with this passage. Like, if I had to name one, like, stumbling block in my faith, it would be, like, I really question the power of prayer, and I don't really understand why. Like, I believe in the power of prayer, but then I'm sure we've all had experiences where, you pray for the sick, like he says to, and they don't get better. So things like that where I'm worried if I tried to preach on this, it would be me working out my own issues. But
it's always a good thing for the pulpit.
Sometimes that could be like helpful if you're just authentically like, I struggle with this too, but I don't know. Tell me what you think about it.
I can't remember where I read it. It kind of just was a spark, and then the more I kept thinking about it, I do like the book of James. I think this is the conclusion of the book of James, and so you can kind of like go back to the thesis and maybe hit all the high points, especially if you've been preaching through the book of James. I know most Episcopalians don't do like sermon series, but some do. But you could talk about things like humility or not showing partiality, and kind of hit those high points and then see this as kind of a cap to all of that. But the thing that I was kind of a spark for me was how this is the opposite of an untamed tongue.
Yeah.
So, in a couple of weeks before is a reading from James 3. And it says, how great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire, and the tongue is a fire. And so we get all of this language about taming the tongue. And then here it gives you kind of tangible examples of what that would look like. Praying, singing songs of praise. It also talks about confession. So it's these things that you can do with your tongue that are helpful and fruitful. It's not just James being harsh and kind of a downer. Like he's giving us examples of what that looks like to use your tongue for something good. I mean, that's probably where I would go with that.
Would you address at all, like, the prayer of the righteous is powerful and effective? Like, would you address my issue with this passage, or would you kind of not, like, leave that for another day?
I mean, if I did, I think, again, I think going back to other points that he's made in the letter, James talks a lot about being a doer of the word and not just a hearer. So I think maybe talking about prayer associated with action might be a good way to go about that. I don't know if I would go. I don't know if this is the text where I'd go into like what is prayer and how it works best, because it just doesn't feel like there's a whole lot of supporting material there. But if you did use other parts in James to say, well, like what can we pair prayer with? I think things like, doing of the word, taming the tongue, those, or what does humility look like acted out? I think those are helpful things to combine with prayer.
That also makes me think of like how James sees prayer as communal in nature. Like I think we often think it's like, you get up in the morning and you pray just alone with God, which is important, but the, gathering the leaders and laying hands on things like that, that prayer is something we do as the body of Christ and not just by ourselves.
Right. Well, I mean, I think James' kind of underlying point throughout is an embodied faith. So not just something that's in the spiritual dimension, but something that is, kind of has
Even talking about like oil, like using oil.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, you could talk about prayer that way, I think.
Okay, let's read or talk about this reading from Esther. I'm kind of annoyed that we just get the very last little bit of Esther, because it's such an awesome story. Like, I mean, I know this is part of just kind of the ups and downs of preaching a lectionary, but it's like you miss the drama and intrigue of like all these, all the parts of Esther, and you just get like this part out of context where she's just, like you don't even know who Haman is or why.
Right.
So I don't know. I just had to name how I said that. So I think if you were going to preach this passage, you'd have to summarize the whole Esther story.
Oh, definitely. I mean, this is the only time in the lectionary that we hear about Esther.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
so
cool.
I think you have to tell the whole story, but I mean, I'm probably going to preach on this, and I would recommend anybody else to preach on this, partly just because you're not going to hear it for another 3 years, and that's if you're doing the same track. If you're doing a different lectionary track, you might not hear it for 6 more years.
How often also do we have a story that's specifically about a woman in the Old Testament? Like that's rare, Jim.
I agree. I mean, I feel like sometimes we collect these stories about biblical women and they're like used for a women's Bible study or a book study.
Yeah, I know those well.
And the shame is that, the rest of the congregation doesn't get to hear those stories kind of in detail. So I think we should preach the sermon, and I do think you have to tell the kind of whole story, which I think you can sum it up in a way.
Yeah, I think you just changed my mind, because I was thinking of preaching the gospel, but if this is your only chance to preach Esther, that's probably what I would do.
Yeah.
So that's good. So anything in particular you want to preach about Esther?
Well, I mean, I thought about this as like a soap opera. I remember like as a kid, I'd walk in and, I'd be at home sick, my mom would be like watching terrible daytime TV.
Yeah.
And, I'd walk into Days of Our Lives and I would be like, a moment where people are like clutching their pearls and they're like making these odd looks towards the It's like dun dun dun.
Yeah, the music.
Like this is the kind of what you were saying. This is like the conclusion of all of the story that's gone on. And so I think just naming that is important. And then, I think also I would go back and point out some other kind of major passages. And I think the most famous verse is in chapter 4, verse 14, where Mordecai is kind of trying to convince Esther to use her power to help the Jewish people. And it says, "For if you keep silence at a time such as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows, perhaps you've come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." I know that's the kind of the one everybody knows and has crocheted on a pillow. You know. But I think that's kind of an important verse. How can we use our power for the powerless?
Yeah.
And I think that ties into the gospel.
Totally, yeah. Yeah, that was the same thing I thought about, is like Esther kind of finds herself in this position, she's a queen and it's only she has the potential to save, the Jewish people. And so just sort of drawing on the idea of like using your resources and your position to protect, like just what you said, just to protect the vulnerable and carry out the purpose of God. And I think you don't have to be a queen. All of us can look around and, kind of take stock of what gifts do I have to serve God with.
Right. I do think there's a potential pitfall here in kind of seeing ourselves in the shoes of an oppressed minority.
True.
I mean, that's always problematic, and we can do that often throughout the Bible. So I think trying to tell the story in a way where you show a people who are kind of under the threat of a future genocide, and how that isn't really related to our story or context, I think might be something important to note, instead of allowing people to feel like an oppressed minority when they're not.
Yeah, that'd be more of a challenging sermon for a lot of people. But I mean, it's good.
Yeah, maybe this is the place to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the last thing I think you could do with Esther is, it would take a little bit of research, but to understand how this book is used by Jewish people. So, how this is kind of the basis for Purim. And I don't know, maybe like talk to a rabbi or somebody who's Jewish and see how, number one, like what that festival is about. And, I think there's some interesting things, like Jewish people read through the entire book of Esther and they like put on plays, and it's kind of like overacted in some ways, and people like boo at the name of Haman. Anytime Haman is mentioned, people boo in his.
Nice.
So just looking into how this is used culturally, I think is really interesting as well.
Okay, so we've run through the three texts for today and sort of highlighted some different things to think about, maybe different jumping off points. But let's focus in, narrow down a little bit. What would you preach this Sunday, Brian?
I mean, I kind of gave it away when we were talking about it, but I would definitely preach Esther's story. I think you have to, again, tell the entire thing, but it's kind of that's a little bit of a challenge, but I think it's necessary for us to lift up, examples of women in the biblical text whenever we can. I would probably spend some time with the verse in chapter 4, keeping silent such a time as this. And I wouldn't really tie it to contemporary events. I think we can sometimes kind of write ourselves into a corner doing that. But talking about the ways that we can be vocal about our faith and really active in lifting up the powerless. I think that would be kind of an important theme for Esther.
Yeah, and I feel like there's plenty like kind of in the air right now where people's imaginations could easily come up with a lot of different scenarios to do that. So that's cool. Yeah, I love that. Like I said, I think you maybe changed my mind about preaching Esther. But what I was thinking was, I had kind of two thoughts for preaching the gospel. One is the idea that Jesus is not a micromanager, so really kind of focusing in on that person out there who is casting out demons that we really know nothing about. And just talking about how as disciples of Christ, like we have the freedom to live out the gospel given our unique gifts and the way God made us. And so Jesus just sort of empowers us, I think. You know, he's gives us his spirit and says, like, go for it. And I think, especially in the church, we can sometimes be kind of like fear-based and like, never done it that way, or what will people say, or, you know, whatever it is. And we might need that reminder that we can, you know, within kind of the bounds of like biblical tradition, we can do what we want and have fun with it, hopefully. So, you know, I think the image for that would be like, I think we've all had bosses who micromanage and we know how miserable that is, versus bosses who are like empowering and supportive and are like, I love that idea, go do it.
Yeah.
And then the other kind of track I thought about was Jesus, you know, multiple times tells his disciples to be salty, not sweet. And that, to me, that really kind of changes, like it's a little bit jarring. Because I think a lot of times we think as Christians we're supposed to be nice, and by nice we mean like don't ruffle any feathers, don't rock the boat, be polite, you know. But that's really not how Jesus lived, how his saints lived. And so I would connect that in with Esther, with how she was salty. And I think I would also talk about, you know, if we're imagining Jesus still holding that child, which I love that image, you know, fiercely protecting children and the vulnerable takes like a salty strength. You know, it's not like, hey guys, could you not, like you have to really use your voice and kind of get people's attention. So yeah, I was thinking about the, you know those, I don't know how old they are, I don't know if they're like Renaissance or older, Middle Ages, those pictures of the Virgin Mary punching the devil in the face. That's the image that came to mind. Like, you know, we have a lot of images of the Virgin Mary as like sweet and meek, and that's true too. Yeah. But she also is like punching the devil in the face.
I like it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being on the show. Thank you all for watching, and happy sermon writing.